All right, noble ones. We watched one, might as well watch the other one. So not so long ago, I made a video response to this. What did Romans think about race and identity? And I have to say that there were a couple of things that I think I really didn't agree with, but in general, it was an overall okay video. I was actually expecting a lot worse. Why am I here covering it? Goodness gracious. Sorry, I meant this. The presentation was quite fair and is stuck to the sources. However, I do want to check this other one, where the ancient Greeks racists.
Ethnic and racial prejudice is a common occurrence in history, brought upon by power dynamics that emerge between different peoples. While not a natural human impulse, the development of ethnic and racial stereotypes often occurred due to political circumstances. Just like in
I don't know, man. I already disagree with that. So here is what I think. First and foremost, is it natural to be racist? And does it occur because of political power dynamics? Yes to the first, no to the second. So, is it natural to be racist? Yes. Now, given, it doesn't mean, natural doesn't mean good. Before anyone is like, oh, look what Metatron said. It's natural to devour another animal's children in the egg to clear the area. It's natural to attack another free-living entity in order to eat their flesh. Natural does not mean good. Natural just means that it occurs due to the way we are hardwired as species that live, coexist, and often compete for resources and the ability to reproduce on this planet. Now, first and foremost, to really unpack this statement, when we say racism, but we go back into ancient times, it's not going to be the same racism as today. It will have some areas of commonality, but today racism is different in some aspects. In fact, when we go to prehistory, we should probably call it proto-racism if we really wanted to. The idea, I think, is not just a matter of power dynamics. You have a powerful group, the politically superior, and then there is a group, poor guys, they're being preyed upon. Yeah, of course that happens. But it's not the prerequisite for any form of racism, xenophobia, the birth of derogatory language, and that kind of stuff. It is an in-group versus out-group dynamic. So, particularly in prehistory or in times where surviving was very difficult, so you have your family extended to your tribe, and you know people in the tribe. You don't like all of them, but you know them. These are the people you hunt with, these are part of your family, and that's that. But then you see another tribe, and perhaps they look different, they dress different, maybe they have different phenotypic traits. All of these things, not just the skin, all of these characteristics clearly create a distinction between in-group and out-group. Now, does out-group mean foe or does it mean friend? You don't know. And sometimes I think it could be natural in this world to have an immediate reaction to, let's assume they are foes, but then if I'm wrong and they were friends, good, we're ally and all the rest that comes from that. I think the very basic beginning of what will eventually develop into actual racism may come from this, a simple in versus out group. It is, of course, something that we can use reason, logic to overcome, but it is a natural instinct. It's not always necessarily connected, as he seems to have stated here, to power political dynamics.
our modern world, the ancient world certainly had its own views on ethnicity and race, which were at times very familiar to us and at times completely alien to the modern eye.
Exactly.
In this series, we will discuss the conception of ethnicity and race in various ancient societies, such as Greece, Rome, and Egypt. We will do this by looking at art and texts from those societies and contextualizing historical events from their respective eras. In this first video, we will transport you to the ancient polis of Hellas and explore perceptions of race, identity, ethnicity, and racism in the world of ancient Greece. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members.
So I'm afraid that even though he's usually pretty good at checking the sources, considering the premise was faulty at first, I'm afraid that that's going to taint the rest of the data analysis here.
For help. The ancient world did not have racism as we perceive it today, as modern racism is built upon the advent of capitalism and European colonialism, and finding excuses to justify its brutality.
Okay, the other video was fine. This video is not, I'm afraid to say. So, is modern racism based on the backs of capitalism and colonialism? No. It is expressed by these. I mean, capitalism is an economic system anyways. I'm not sure why you're connecting it to racism. You'll have to explain this one. So how is that racist? I don't get it. But when it comes to colonialism, of course, but if it was only connected to colonialism, so in order to be racist, it needs to be tied to colonialism, then what that would mean is that anyone who is not a colonial power, meaning a European colonial power, even though they may completely hate another race or another ethnicity, well, technically not racism because they're not colonialists. That's stupid. So no, these two premises, once again, the premise is incorrect.
However, ancient Greece did have societal prejudices, and there is some debate amongst scholars as to whether this part of Greek thought constituted racism, defined as prejudice based on biological racial features, or ethnic prejudice, defined as prejudice based on cultural traits.
Right.
Some modern scholars believe that ancient Greek prejudices against the various peoples of the ancient Near East were non-hereditary, based not on race but on language and culture. Moreover, these modern scholars assert that racism as we know it today has its origins in the African slave trade of the Europe.
Okay, so these modern scholars are absolute clowns, and it's a shame, kings and generals. I honestly thought you were better than this. It's a shame that you're listening to their propaganda. Nonsense. Racism is a lot more ancient than African slave trade. In fact, if anything, it was Africans that were enslaving other Africans even before the European man came into the picture. Of course, you could give me a comeback and say, well, but it's not racism because it's Africa, it's black versus black. No, because Africa has the highest amount of diversity in phenotypic traits within the entirety of the planet. So if anything, you cannot just point at two people from Africa, they're black, and then say, well, they're the same. They're not the same. So absolutely, they can be racist between themselves as well. Asians can be racist towards white people. Black people can be racist towards white people. Anyone can be racist towards anyone. There was absolutely racism before. You see, that's what they do. They twist the meaning of words. They twist the meaning of words. They say, no, it's not racist if it's not systemic. And they say it's not racist if it's not connected to colonialism. It's not racist. It is racist if it's derogatory and if there is strong prejudice based on ethnicity. And what he said earlier on, it's true. Some professors say it. That's why they are clowns. When he said earlier on that it was non-hereditary. Oh, yeah? Oh my gosh, it was non-hereditary. So it's like they just didn't like that person, but other people from the same, it absolutely was. Absolutely was. They are just making shit up. And what about the guy who described the Ethiopian soldier, and because he was black, he was a bad omen? Would you be okay saying that today? No, you'd be called a racist. So why are you not calling that person who said it a racist? There are plenty of situations like this in the ancient period. Plenty.
European colonial era millennia later. When trying to understand the concept of identity in antiquity, it should be noted that our window into the ancient world's attitude towards race and ethnicity survives to us through written records and artwork that only the elite would have been able to afford, and therefore reflect the attitudes of the social elite and not the common people.
Yeah.
Indeed, the average person likely did not share the beliefs of the elites, though prejudices definitely pervaded into commoner populations, much like today.
I agree with this. And finally, some statements that make sense. Of course, if you're reading a philosopher, if you're reading a nobleman or an aristocrat, it doesn't automatically share the... automatically doesn't mean that every single person from ancient Greece thinks that way. In fact, oftentimes, the very philosophers disagree with each other pretty strongly indeed.
With all this in mind, we will tackle the past's complexities as holistically as possible. Authors in antiquity held a variety of views of ethnicity and race, wildly diverging in space and time. However, one consistent trope that does emerge from ancient writing is a form of environmental determinism, or the notion that the climate sets up people's traits and behavior into stereotyped others.
Same for the Romans.
For instance, in the Archaic period, Hesiod's Theogony discusses monstrous races of people living on the corners of the known world, a pattern that has continued in later authors such as Herodotus and Ctesias, who describe bizarre races such as a breed of one-legged people with one massive foot living in India. Such stories show that the Greeks thought that extreme climates, different from their own, produced different kinds of people, to the extent of changing their physical image.
I mean, they were right. Not for the single-legged leg, and there is more than that, actually. Yeah, but climate is, well, not just climate, but in general, a way to adapt to certain conditions, shape our phenotypic traits. So it's not that they were completely wrong.
These accounts are, of course, based on nothing more than tall tales, but the environmental determinism shines in Hesiod's pessimistic view of human society. His theogony describes the 5 ages, with its own race of humans, called gold, silver, copper, heroic, and iron, being the current one. Much like the yugas in Hinduism, showing progressive degeneration of human quality of life, Hesiod sets out a view that human lives become worse over the generations, with the golden race under the titan Kronos being eternally young, contrasting with the iron race, which had no connection to the gods. The 5 races are defined by their physical traits, which correspond to their virtue or behavior. He also, in his account of the flood of Deucalion, mentions how the Greeks are descended from the last of the copper race, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. This flood myth postulates that Zeus sent a flood that purged the copper race from the earth due to their destructive nature. As the only 2 survivors of this cataclysm, Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulated the earth in 2 ways. One was by throwing stones behind them that turned into humans, creating the other nations of the earth, while the other was them giving birth to Helenus, who is considered the first ancestor of all the Greeks. Helenus' children and grandchildren would bear names like Ion, Aelos, or Achios, and were considered to be the progeny of the various sub-tribes of the Greeks, like the Ionians, Aeolians, and Achaeans. The implication is that Greeks have a distinct racial background from other peoples, having come from Deucalion and not formed out of stones. The differences between different groups of humans were interpreted in various contrasting ways by a multitude of ancient authors. Aristotle believed that non-Greeks were, like enslaved peoples in Greece, inherently servile, and therefore deserved to be ruled by Greeks. Aristotle's most famous...
Of course, that is a political position and usually can be used as a justification. We do find this, though, this idea of, well, we are the best and everyone else is not as good as us. It's literally everywhere, particularly in this period.
This theory, the golden mean, or the idea that virtue is found between extreme values, is actually used to justify his Greco-supremacist way of thinking by way of the aforementioned theory of environmental determinism. In Aristotle's school of thought, people in hot climates, such as the Ethiopians, were too servile, while people in cold climates, such as the Northern Europeans, were too reckless. In contrast, the Greeks, who lived in moderate climates, were the ideal human beings.
That's pretty much the same that the Romans say. They do go a little further than that when they discuss the differences, because at the end of the day, this is actually an interesting representation to how the Romans saw the world. And they do use colors to describe this. The Romans, as the Mediterraneans, they also say we are masters of the world because we are in the perfect medium. Climatically, it's very similar. Of course, they swap it with the Greeks, but I guess it's the same concept. But the Romans do say, they call themselves white. There is this passage and says, so there are 3 kinds of people. White, that's us. So that's how the Mediterraneans refer to themselves. Then there is Ethiopians, and they mean black people. In fact, when they say Ethiopians, they don't just mean black people from Ethiopia, they mean all black people. It's used Aethiopian. It's used for all people that were black. And then the Nordic types, they are referred to as blondes, the blondes. Isn't that interesting? And so, yeah, there is whites, blacks, and blondes. So whites, Ethiopians, and blondes is how the Romans differentiated different people. This is just to underline also and respond to those people that say the concept of white didn't exist. Well, it's not the same concept as Benjamin Franklin, but the word was used by the Romans to identify themselves precisely.
Succumbing neither to sycophantic servility nor barbaric brutality, yielding to neither extreme. Hippocrates, one of Greece's most important physicians, was a major proponent of this theory and applied it to ethnic groups across the world. As Aristotle also shows other forms of prejudice, such as classism and sexism, this means that he considers these to be physical distinctions as well. As an example, he considers slaves to have inherent physical and mental differences from non-slaves.
When it comes to sexism, I mean, Who wouldn't be sexist? If you really want to use... That's the problem with using terminology that it's modern, because it comes packaged with certain expectations in our view of reality. Saying the ancient Greeks were sexist because they thought this and they thought that, yeah, of course. For instance, women couldn't vote in ancient Greek democracy. It's democracy, but they couldn't vote. Different from modern democracy. But wasn't everyone sexist then at this point? Who's not sexist? You can go to any continent in this period. Tell me who is not sexist. It's... I mean, I'm sure you wait 500 years from now. Let's see what we are to them.
And that this supposedly justifies their enslavement. When applied to foreigners, this suggests to Aristotle that they are inherently servile and that Greeks should rule over them. This is an example of an influential ancient author essentializing prejudice against other peoples and even placing Greeks as racially superior people to them. In contrast to Aristotle, some other ancient Greek authors appeared far more tolerant of non-Greek peoples. An example of this is Herodotus, the father of history. In his works, Herodotus tries to explain why different non-Greek peoples look the way they do and behave the way they behave. However, his narration is relatively neutral and does not necessarily show any sort of prejudice towards these people groups.
Of course, it would have varied, as they did say at the beginning, and that was the part that I would agree. It's wrong to say, oh, the Romans thought X, or the ancient Greeks thought Y. Given, you can find some things that are generally accepted by the majority of the population. You will, absolutely. But then again, other times when just because you read one author, you shouldn't say the Greeks thought. That's why it's important to dig and dive into the sources. Because if you read a lot of authors that think that, then it's one thing. But if you see that they start giving different perspective, also depending on which factions they belong to, their social class, as explained, then you get a more complex picture. And perhaps on that specific instance, that wasn't a situation where, well, everyone would have agreed. Some scenarios like that exist, but oftentimes this happens, and you have varied approaches. This happens also in ancient Roman politics, by the way. If you see, there is an interesting discussion between the senatorial class and Claudius, specifically about granting citizenship to foreigners. In that case, I think they were trying to grant it to Gaul families, and the senatorial class was against it. Claudius was in favor of it, and they have this debate. And it's interesting because then again, if you said the Romans freely granted to everyone, well, it depends which faction. It depends.
This is likely due to the fact that, unlike Aristotle, who lived in Greece and only saw foreigners as slaves and merchants, Herodotus actually travelled to many of the places he wrote about.
Including Egypt.
As an example, his third book of the Histories is completely dedicated to Egypt, and he goes into depth as to why the northern and southern Egyptians look different, and what differences both groups have from the Greeks.
That's another thing that I often bring up. And then I'm always they try to crucify me for it. Yeah, he does mention about the difference between northern Africans and Africans from the south, or the hinterland and the center of Africa, including Kingdom of Kush, of course, Nubia. And yes, there is a certain group that doesn't like what the man says.
However, there is no trace of prejudice in these passages, and Herodotus even shows some admiration for Egyptian knowledge.
Yeah.
Similarly, Herodotus' account of the nomadic Scythians discusses some ethnic markers, such as tribes of people who were of partial Greek and Scythian descent having different traits from both. Like the Egyptians, Herodotus displays some admiration for the Scythians, whom he respected due to their opposition to Persian imperialism. Speaking of Persia, Herodotus portrays the Persians in a relatively nuanced way, despite being the historic enemies of Hellas. He does not depict them as inherently servile, acknowledging that they were living in a different, but not necessarily inferior way.
Yeah, I mean, with that we have to contextualize. Good luck saying that they are inherently servile if they are like conquering empire. I mean, the two things just wouldn't make sense. Oh no, they're born to be slaves. But they're conquering like everything. It's like, this is a very intelligent man we're talking about, Herodotus. You know what I mean? It has to make logics and ancient Greeks. It's a big thing.
Moreover, the Persian King of Kings, Darius the Great, is treated with remarkable respect in the text. The Greco-Persian Wars in Herodotus is an anti-imperialist struggle against foreigners who wish to conquer and control Greece, not a struggle of civilizations, or between a civilized West and a barbaric East, as many claim today. Having discussed some authors and their views, we will now move on to social attitudes and laws towards non-Greeks by Greeks. This is an inherently difficult endeavour, as the ancient Greek world underwent many changes over the centuries, from the Mycenaean to the Hellenistic period and beyond, while the Greeks themselves colonized regions as far apart as Iberia and Pakistan. This naturally leads to a lot of diversity across time and space when it comes to the ancient Greeks' relationship with and perception of the non-Greek peoples around them. Ancient Athens is an interesting example of ancient notions of ethnicity and race due to its claim to autochthony, or being born from the earth. Many Greek polis had myths of founders who migrated from elsewhere, like Heracles being a progenitor of the Macedonians. Athenians usually saw themselves as having been literally born from the earth, as descendants of the snake man Erechtheus. As democracy expanded in Athens, questions of ethnicity propelled what Jonathan Hall has called racialized citizenship. This led the Athenians to consider themselves an ethnic group that was separate from others in order to have a limit to their community's franchise. Solon, the archaic period law...
See what he's writing here, because he never reads it. Athenians were notoriously arrogant in ancient Greece, and this ideology explains Athenian imperialism in the Delian League. Why some Macedonians were not considered Greeks by the people. But this about Macedonians not being considered Greeks is... Yeah, Macedonians were Greeks. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it's... I have a video. That's why I'm not going into the details. I'll put it in a link in the description. I'm just going to say Macedonians were Greek. When it comes to Athenians being notoriously arrogant, you just stated that that's a matter of the elites rather than necessarily the entirety of the population. And yeah, it's a matter of who is saying that. So probably the Athenians didn't like someone from Sparta, and Sparta didn't like someone from Athens. And of course, they're going to call each other things and names.
Who shifted Athens from an aristocracy to an oligarchy, initiated reforms that freed Athenians from servitude by forgiving their debts to their masters, and in a sense ensured that slaves in Athens would almost exclusively have non-Athenian origins, as the Athenians who became slaves were freed and their ranks were filled with non-Athenians. The ethnic makeup of Athenian citizenry later shifted with two major expansions of the franchise of various essential workers, like the rowers of the Athenian fleet during the late Peloponnesian War due to their service in fighting Sparta, and the political leverage their military performance provided. This was
I don't think it mattered at that point where they were from, to be honest. It's just that it's the military efficacy.
Cried by some Athenian politicians, like Demosthenes, who claimed Athens was becoming impure because of the newly enfranchised population not being autochthonous. Thus, we can see that parts of the Athenian population harbour ethnically prejudiced beliefs.
Sure.
However, we must also acknowledge that there were other class motives at play. For instance, a major element of Athenian racial citizenship was the limitation of citizenship laws by Pericles, from only needing paternal descent to requiring both an Athenian mother and father in order to qualify for citizenship. Athenian men of wealthy means often took foreign wives, and this gave them more wealth and status. It is thus possible that this law was more about constricting this possibility and being a populist measure against the elites.
Because of course if you're not a citizen you don't get to vote. That's basically how it is.
All Greek polis had their own such institutions to regulate citizenship, and this was often linked to the ability to go to places like gymnasia or participate in the agora. These restrictive enfranchisement policies were criticized by the philosopher Zeno of Citium, who claimed that the ideal polis had no gymnasia or courts. In his ideal Hellenic
good luck with that to the ancient Greeks, pitching that one to the rest of the Greeks.
Society, everyone participated in free love, no temples of gods existed, as people were virtuous and pious everywhere, and everyone wore the same clothes to eliminate the distinctions between foreigner and native, and
define free love.
Male and female. This is an early anarchist philosophy, a likely critique of Plato's Republic, which describes a class-based society ruled by philosopher kings, and a critique of Athenian citizenship laws.
Philosopher king. I mean, I can get by that. Maybe like a philosopher politician. Can you imagine that?
Institutions of citizenship took an intriguing role when the Hellenistic age began, as Hellenic cities were...
Okay, so let me see. Usually I don't watch the entire thing. General stereotypes, let's go.
So, were there specific stereotypes about ethnic groups in ancient
Yes.
Greece, and did these result in general prejudice amongst the Greeks?
Sometimes, yes.
Benjamin Isaac notes how in Homer's Odyssey, of all places, the Phoenicians are depicted as being great at crafts, trade, and naval conduct. While this can be seen as a form of positive prejudice, the Phoenicians' skill at commerce and seafaring is ultimately associated with their inherent tendency to be scheming and treacherous. This attitude towards the Phoenicians was common among the Greeks, as the Phoenicians were their primary rival when it came to the colonization of the Mediterranean.
You know, even this, just reconnecting to what we were saying earlier on, and this idea that some try to push, oh, well, it's not actually technically racism unless it's colonialism and this and that. Okay, well then tell me this. We just listened to this. So basically he's saying the Phoenician, the dire people, all of them, Phoenicians, they are naturally treacherous. Naturally treacherous. Okay? And you might think, well, yeah, but it's ancient people, so Phoenicians. Okay, right. Could you imagine if you swapped the word Phoenician and put black in it? Can you say it out loud? Probably no, you're going to get cancelled. You're going to get called a racist. Personally, if you swap and put Asian, or if you swap and put white, yeah, all the same. It would be considered a racist statement, 100%, if we say the exact same sentence and swap. And well, if we put white, some people will be like, not technically racist, but for a moment to detain me. Put one of these ethnicities in there. Don't actually do it, but I'm saying, imagine if you said that in any forum, you would get people that say, oh, you're just a racist, or you would get people that would agree with you. Yeah, preach it, brother. That's what would happen. So, if it's the same sentence, would get you labeled a racist in the exact same context. Why are you trying to say now, technically it's not racism because it's, unless there is colonialism and power dynamics. You just defeated your own argument. And that's the truth of it. That's the truth of it.
Ptolemy of Alexandria took the Anti-Phoenician of a bull and mother of King Minos of admired them for their wisdom. A Greek from Chaeronea explicitly attacks Herodotus for his admiration of the Egyptians, as he considers them to be fools for worshipping animal-headed gods. The Jewish people fared worse in Hellenic eyes and were subject to violent pogroms by the pagan Greeks, such as a massacre in Alexandria in 68 CE, with Roman governors fanning the flames. These stereotypes often included early anti-Semitic tropes, or attacks on Jewish practices like the Shabbat. Even other Greek-speaking peoples did not escape Greek stereotyping. The Macedonian...
I mean, yeah, once again, stereotyping, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Conclusion.
world. In conclusion, the attitudes that the ancient Greeks held towards non-Greek peoples were highly varied and capable of being both positive and negative. Some ancient Greek beliefs about their cultural neighbours were clear prejudices, though there were variations as to whether these were based on hereditary racial superiority or non-hereditary cultural prejudices. These beliefs and practices had varying legal and philosophical receptions, from Herodotus' general interest and acceptance to Aristotle's essentializing prejudice, and from Athens' citizenship laws to the cultural fluidity of the Hellenistic cities in places like Egypt and Central Asia. Understanding these ancient attitudes is important for us to develop a more intimate knowledge of how society worked in the past, and how their cultural biases could be wielded for political gain or ignored in favor of tolerance. It is social structures that create prejudice or tolerance, so looking at the past can help.
Once again, it is social. Yeah, he did use this wrong premise. No, social structures also foster prejudice and intolerance. Absolutely they can. But they don't create it. Because if that were the case, this in-group, out-group concept that we just mentioned when it comes to the freaking Paleolithic shouldn't exist. It should not exist.
Us understand our own societies and how to make tolerance, so looking at the past can help us understand our own societies and how to make them better. More videos on this topic are on the way.
No, sorry, Kings in general didn't like this one. I mean, some things, sure, but the premise was wrong and therefore the conclusion was too. But anyways, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. If you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth.